It is a pleasure to be here with everybody today. It's a pleasure to be back in Dubai. This is my third or fourth trip here, and love interacting with the companies and organizations that are represented here in the Middle East. And I look forward to the interactions throughout the rest of the day. My job is an analyst, and so I spend my days researching and understanding the complexities and challenges of what keeps you up at night in the context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how to go about solving that with strategy, process, and technology. I spent 7 years at Forrester, where I did, back on a cold, snowy day in February 2002, define and label a market for technology called GRC. And I spent 7 years at Forrester and now 15 years on my own. So let's get into the state of GRC in 2023. You know, we have a future that we're headed towards. And it's up to us to define what that future is. I don't know about you, but I'm a science fiction fan. And so are we headed towards that dystopia, that environmental and social disaster of Blade Runner? Or are we headed towards that future of Star Trek? And just in Dubai, one of the comments I've made to my wife and even my family back home, but my wife's here with me, is that Dubai looks like very much like a Star Trek city. You look at the Star Trek films and things like that, and you see the future several centuries out, and to me, Dubai looks like that. But where are we headed as a global perspective? Are we headed towards that future Star Trek, where it's clean, it's environmentally friendly, socially cooperative? Obviously, they're movies, so there's tensions and there has to be resolution, but it's not that depressing dystopia of Blade Runner. The decisions that organizations make, as well as governments, sets us on the course to one of these two futures or somewhere in between. And we need to start thinking about that now as how our companies and our organizations do business and interact and address risks in our environment impacts the future that we set for ourselves. Now, the challenge with organizations today is what I call navigating chaos. And I actually wrote a paper on this for the Institute of Risk Management in London. And the modern organization is very complex. There's lots of changing laws and regulations. Just in one industry, financial services, if you use Thomson Reuters figures, global financial services firms are dealing with 257 regulatory change events every business day coming from 1,217 regulators around the world. That's a lot of regulatory change. It could be a new law or regulation, a change law or regulation, notice of proposed rulemaking. A lot of them are enforcement actions on how those regulations are being enforced on organizations. We have a lot of legal and regulatory change. We also have a lot of risk change, geopolitical risks, economic risks, change in commodity like oil prices and things. All these risks impact us, but also part of those risks shifts in technology. Gosh, 15, 20 years ago, we were dealing with social media policies. How do we deal with LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and things that are being used for business purposes? 10 years ago is bring your own device policies. How do we deal with tablets and iPhones and laptops that are personal devices that are being used for business purposes? The last 5 years, it's been the Internet of Things. How do we manage the complexity of everything being connected? And Torian will be opening up his presentation with just one of those examples there as well. But everything's connected. How do we deal with the vulnerability and exposure that the microwave being connected to the internet in the break room brings to our organization? These are all things we are challenged with. And now we're dealing with artificial intelligence technologies. And there's so much, and when it comes to cognitive technologies, there's so much benefit and value from them, but there's also risks. What if those models fail or they break or they're biased in some way that lead to wrong and inappropriate decisions for the organization? And there's a lot of model governance that has to come into play and testing and validation of artificial intelligence models. There's so much complexity. So I talked about regulatory change, I talked about risk change, but there's also change to the business. And right now, those risks and regulations, those could be a lot of back office functions of second and third line, those risk management, audit, compliance, but the business is changing. Employees are coming into the organization. They move from one role to another. They exit the organization. Processes change, technology change. But even more complex is that the modern organization is the extended enterprise. The modern organization is not defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. The modern organization is this extended web of suppliers, vendors, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries, temporary workers, partners, and more. They all define your organization. Their risks are your risks. Their compliance issues are your compliance issues. Lack of resiliency in things can impact your bottom line in achieving your objectives. Now, we have to keep all this in sync, and that's the challenge for organizations today. We can be completely knowledgeable about the law and regulation, and we can answer every question on it and know it inside and out, but if that employee came into the organization, wasn't trained, didn't sign the policy, or that technology was upgraded and it's not configured properly and the controls aren't in place, you're not compliant. Doesn't matter how intelligent you are about the law if you're not keeping all this change in sync. Now, trying to manage governance, risk, and compliance, or today what we're calling GPRC, governance, performance, risk, and compliance, and documents, spreadsheets, and emails is a recipe for disaster. It's what I call the inevitability of failure, and that organizations end up managing documents and not managing risk. In fact, one bank I talked to did an internal study of their manual processes for risk and compliance and found out that 80% of their staff time across risk, compliance, and audit, internal control functions, 80% of their staff time was actually managing and chasing documents and not managing risk. Another firm I was talking to is spending 200 hours to build a report on risk events for the board of directors every year. Year after year, 200 hours to build this report. The last year they built that before they automated with technology, they found that they had risk issues that started 11 months ago were out of control now because they don't have real-time visibility into their risks. It takes 200 hours to compile a report and aggregate, tabulate, and bring everything together to find out that they had risk issues that started 11 months ago. That's not managing risk, that's reacting to risk. We need greater insight and visibility into risk. A lot of GRC programs and organizations remind me of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California in the USA. Now, I'm assuming most here probably haven't seen that. I've seen it from the outside. I actually haven't gone into it, but it's an example of how GRC is done in a lot of organizations today. This is a sprawling mansion that was built in the 1800s. It cost $5.5 million to build back in the 1800s. You calculate inflation, that's one very expensive house today. It took 38 years to build. It had no design, no blueprint, no architect. So at the end of the day, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It has staircases that go up or down to nowhere, doors that open to 20-foot drops or to walls. You can't walk through the door. Skylights that are in floors instead of ceilings. This is a lot of your risk programs in your organization. That over the last 38 years, you've had all these little silos, like 147 different builders of risk management with no design to how they're building. And all of a sudden, IT security is doing risk this way, and operational risk is doing it this way, and procurement, looking at supplier risk, is doing it this way, and compliance risks and compliance ethics are being managed this way, and environmental and health and safety and quality and HR and finance and accounting. It's like all these little fragmented silos of risk. Nobody has complete visibility into it. And that's an issue. COVID-19 is an example. What starts off with a health and safety risk cascades into risks of IT security risk in the home office environment, privacy risk in the home office environment, increased risk of fraud because of economic uncertainty and risk exposure in achieving our objectives, increased risk of bribery and corruption because there's limited government contracts and import-exports closed down. There's greater risk that somebody might bribe a foreign government official to expedite goods through customs and things. Increased risk of modern slavery as the factories go dark because of the illness. They reopen with child labor, forced labor, and other issues like that. It's an interconnected risk environment. I often use the example of the Titanic in explaining this as well. And there's overconfidence in the ship's design with the CEO of the ship being the captain of the ship, Captain E.J. Smith. You had a push to get across the Atlantic quickly to show its speed and power of the day. There's overconfidence with the press. They said the Titanic was unsinkable. The public believed that you couldn't sink this ship. It sank on its maiden voyage. But you had a complexities of risk. It wasn't one risk. It wasn't just about a ship hitting an iceberg. There was health and safety risks. There wasn't a proper number of passengers or a number of lifeboats and life preservers for the number of passengers on board. They tell us that it was being pushed across the Atlantic quickly to show its speed and power of the day. And the size of the rudder and propeller were undersized to the massive size of the ship. The iron ore used in the rivets to hold the seams of the ship together was of a brittle and inferior quality. When it hit the iceberg, the seams of the ship ripped wide open. And I can go on and on. And I mean, there's oversight functions. They're getting warnings from other ships in the area that said, a warning, icebergs are in the area. One of the responses back from the Titanic was, shut up, we're tired of hearing about it. And it goes on and on. It was a multiplicity of risk exposure and issues that contributed to that disaster of the Titanic. It's an interconnected risk environment. Today's organization has to be able to see the tree as well as the forest, that individual risk as well as the interconnectedness of risks and objectives and overall exposure as they interconnect and cascade and has exponential impact. But it's not just about the trees and the forest, it also gets down to the details, the leaves and the branches of the organization as well. So that brings us to what I call the official definition of GRC. This is the definition of governance, risk, and compliance that's found in the OSEG GRC capability model. GRC is the capability to first and foremost reliably achieve objectives. That's the G in GRC, reliable achievement of objectives, the setting achievement of objectives. That actually ties into what we're calling GPRC, the performance with the P. But the reliable achievement of objectives is the governance piece, and the performance is measured against that. And those objectives can be set at the entity level, the division, the department, the process, the project, or even the asset level. And we set those objectives, but we have to address uncertainty in achieving those objectives. That's the risk management. ISO 31000, the international standard on risk management, defines risk as risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And so there's a relationship there. We also have to act with integrity. That's the compliance piece. Not just to laws and regulations, but to our values and ethics, our policies, our controls. All these work in context with each other. Governance, risk, and compliance. Governance sets the direction and strategy for the organization to reliably achieve objectives. Governance sets the context for risk management. Without context, risk management fails. We don't just wake up one day and say, I feel like doing a risk assessment. What shall I do a risk assessment of? No, risk assessment requires context. We need to be able to have that context. Objectives provide the context for risk management. As I said, ISO 31000 says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So what are the objectives? And let's measure the risk, the uncertainty, to achieving those objectives. Risk management seeks to manage and understand uncertainty by the identification, assessment, and monitoring of risk within its context of objectives to be able to act on it. And when we act on risk, there's 4 things we can do. We can accept the risk as it is, saying, okay, we understand that's a risk. We're not going to do anything about it. That's acceptable. We can avoid the risk if that's a possibility by making a decision where there's no longer a risk. We can transfer the risk like through hedging, insurance, derivatives. But the one we focus on most often is risk mitigation. We have our inherent risk that's in this exposure area, and we implement A, B, and C controls. And if those controls are implemented, we believe this risk will be at this residual level, which we then find acceptable. But risk management, if we walk away from that, whoever says that those controls are being implemented and they're operating and effective? No, we need compliance to be the follow-through to ensure that those controls are out there and functioning. Compliance aims to see that the organization acts with integrity and fulfilling its regulatory, contractual, and self-imposed obligations and values. Compliance follows through on risk treatment plans to assure that risk is being managed within limits and controls are in place and functioning. GRC done right requires that there's collaboration across the business, that we move away from this Winchester mystery house of all these different departments and doing different things in different ways to an integrated strategy. And so there's 5 key trends that I'm monitoring in GRC as an analyst in my research in 2023. The first one is agility, risk agility. The second one is resilience, particularly operational resilience, but broader business resilience as well. The third one is integrity, again, particularly in the context of what we're calling ESG, environmental social governance. The fourth one is accountability, GRC, risk and compliance accountability. And the fifth one is engagement. Let's unpack these and look at them. Agility is absolutely critical. If I'm running down a trail or the street and things, agility is the ability to be able to see what's coming at me and be able to navigate the environment. If there's some type of obstacle like a tree or a pothole or a curb or something laying in the road or trail, agility lets me see that and leap over it or go around it, or do some type of acrobatic jump over it or something fun, like you see on the slide there. Agility is necessary. I've seen a lot of organizations move from what the next one we'll talk about, resiliency, to talk about how do we become more risk agile, to be able to see what's developing on the geopolitical risks, the regulatory risks and things. What can we expect 6 months out, 12 months out? How do we prepare the organization for that? What's the scenarios that can unfold so we can navigate the organization with minimal risk exposure? Organizations are looking for risk agility, but they also need resilience. And the last 3 years have shown this with COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, geopolitical risks and economic uncertainty. We need to be resilient. Resilience is the ability to recover from a risk event. Again, if I'm running down that trail or the street and I trip over something, resilience is how quickly can I get back up and start running again. And we see a lot of focus on operational resilience, particularly with regulations around the world. Agility and resilience go hand in hand. Agility is the ability to move quickly and easily, the ability to think and understand what my environment and react to it. Resilience is the ability to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness, elasticity, being able to bounce back. Organizations need to be both agile and resilient. But to deliver on this, particularly risk agility, we need to change the way we approach risk management. A lot of risk management historically has been done at the left side of the brain. That's very important. That's not going away. We still need structured, logical thinking about risk. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes series, says, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist theories to suit facts instead of facts to suit theory." I said that backwards. Begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. We need good quantitative structured data, risk models, quantification. That's all important. But we also need, particularly for the scenarios and what's developing out there, good right brain thinking on risk, that creative and imaginative thinking about risk. Alvin Toffler said you can use all the quantitative data you can get, but you still have to distrust it and use your own intelligence and judgment. I'm saying that both are right. We need good logical left brain thinking and good creative right brain thinking. Now, my dad and my brother were both good at math. They became accountants, and numbers were their careers. Myself, I went to law school. I like words. I like stories. I like images and visualizations. That's where I like bow ties, because one of my favorite risk assessment methodologies is a bow tie risk assessment. I don't have time to go into all that today, but it's a visual view of risk. It engages that right brain thinking, what about that? That could be placed there. That could be placed there. It engages the right brain to think about risk. We need good left brain and right brain thinking on risk. So we talked about risk agility and resilience. The third trend is integrity. And this era of ESG is pushing this forward, the environmental social governance. What we communicate to the world that we are as a country, what we are as an organization, is it a reality out there? If the organization says it complies with these laws and regulations and has these values and so forth, is it a reality or is it just smoke and mirrors? Fiction. We see a huge focus on integrity right now. What we communicate to the world is a reality. That brings us to accountability. We were just discussing this in the CEO roundtable before the event this morning. There's a difference between accountability and responsibilities. The past, a lot of risk was focused on responsibility. I can pass around responsibilities and give them to other people. Accountability means I own this. I can't give other people accountability because I own it. I can give them tasks, responsibilities, but we're seeing more and more clear, structured accountability for risk and compliance. Some of this is in accountability regimes around the world. Some of it's through legal frameworks and things that we're seeing. But there's a huge focus on risk and compliance accountability, not just responsibility. But this also means, and part of our other discussion we had at the CEO roundtable this morning, is engagement. That we need to be able to engage all levels of the organization. Risk, compliance, control, these aren't just back office, second and third line functions. Risk happens at the edge of the organization, in the business, in operations. And so we need to be able to engage all levels of the organization on risk, on control. And in that context of engagement, we need to nurture our culture, our risk culture, our governance culture, our ethical culture. With the Institute of Risk Management in London, I'm one of their global ambassadors of risk. We built the ABC model, part of our risk culture resources for practitioners. And the attitudes of the individuals, from executives down to frontline employees, they shape the behavior of the organization, which forms the culture of the organization, which symbiotically influences further attitudes and behavior. Culture can spiral out of control overnight with the wrong things happening, but it could take years or even decades to repair and build a culture. Culture is a very important asset and requires structured accountability and engagement throughout all levels of the organization on risk and compliance. So what I'm advocating in part one of the keynote, because I'm going to step aside here and then we'll hit part two in just a few minutes, is that we need to develop agile and cognitive GRC. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We're aware of our risks across the business. We're aligned to work together on those risks on different parts of the organization. We're responsive to risk events and what's developing in the scenarios so that we be more agile and navigate the organization, but more resilient in recovering from risk events and doing so in a way that is efficient on our human capital and financial capital resources within the organization.